what is happening here. So I am a trainer at LEORON. I cover financial management and management accounting issues, corporate treasury and things like that. And so this pandemic has been as much a surprise to me as to anybody else. So I must confess that I'm trying to come to grips and to understand what the implications are, along with you who are managing companies and so on, to understand what we need to think about in the financial management of companies area. And I take this quite broadly to mean either listed companies, large corporations, as well as medium-sized companies, maybe private companies and so on. So I hope there's something here that will be of relevance to all of you in the audience. Okay, I'll spend most of my time looking at the short term, the immediate responses, because that is really what concerns us. However, I want to spend just a little bit of time also to look beyond at the medium and the long term, since a lot of us are stuck at home now. I expect we will have a little bit of time to explore longer term issues, because this pandemic seems to have an open-ended nature to it. Let's look at the first topic here: how to understand this recession. And of course, the recession itself is understood as in an economic sense. However, if we go back in history and see other challenges which mankind has been confronted with, you perhaps have come across some articles written about the so-called Spanish influenza of 1918, 1919. That was just 100 years ago, which wiped out something like 50 million people in the world. And I think one of the takeaways from that experience, and I don't know if this conclusion will bear itself out today or not, because things are similar and things are different. We have to try to separate out the two. But one of the conclusions drawn from that experience 100 years ago, not the only conclusion, is that for the economy to get going again in a proper way, we have to beat the virus first. Beating the virus first may mean letting it run itself out through the population. And those people who heal, that's great. Those people who don't, it's unfortunate. Maybe it's finding a vaccine or at least a treatment and so on. That's all medical stuff, which I don't really understand, and I leave that really to the experts. But coming back to the question here, understanding, let's say, how this pandemic compares with other challenges, call it crises, that have been faced in the past. I like to think about it this way. We've had several different types of crises that have confronted mankind, say every few years at this point. We can say that there are natural disasters which occur. You know, for example, the earthquake, which might take place in San Francisco or in Anatolia. And the key thing about an earthquake, of course, or a flood, is that it's kind of regionally focused, which means that while it's terrible for the people who are at the epicenter, we can say that there are other regions which are unaffected, and therefore there's a possibility for assistance to move in on the affected area. So in other words, it's not a worldwide catastrophe. You could say maybe climate change is a slow-moving worldwide catastrophe that will affect everybody, but that's a different subject. Then we could say that there are man-made disasters. Man-made disasters would be, for example, the financial crisis in 2008. Now that is also, the question there is how localized or how broad is it? Well, it created a recession called the Great Recession. And of course, that's something which affected pretty much everybody in different ways. We could even say that the interesting thing about the financial crisis was it began as a banking crisis. And unlike other industries, you can appreciate that when the banks are affected in a systemic way, the failure of one bank tips over like a domino effect and affects other banks so that the whole system is pulled down. And this is unlike other types of industries where if you have a competitor who fails, that's good for the rest of the industry because they can increase their market share. But when the whole banking sector collapses, then a lot of people are going to get hurt. And then, of course, the national authorities and the central banks have to step in, as was done with TARP and other sorts of programs. Then we have another category, just off the top of my head now, in terms of disasters. You could have, say, hybrid disasters that are a combination of natural and man-made. Now, climate change might be one of those, for example. But I was thinking more particularly of the tsunami in the Pacific Ocean, which affected the Fukushima nuclear plant. And so the plant had to shut down, and there were issues there. It's the compromise of that plant with spillover effects meant that an area was contaminated so that car factories had to shut down. So in other words, we had a supply chain impact, which is very much economic. And you could say there's the hand of man in that problem because the nuclear power industry was affected by what was a natural disaster. So where and how we categorize this pandemic at the end of the day, I really will have to leave that to other people to think about. I like to think about the pandemic, which is happening right now, is kind of like a slow motion train wreck, which is occurring. And then we're learning new things about this each day. Okay, so let's try to get closer to the topic today. And I'll spend most of my time on talking about the immediate responses. And I suppose there's probably no reward or no prize for guessing that the first thing that people are going to think about is what is their cash position. And that makes sense. It's sort of like in the movie, the last scene of the movie Casablanca, where the local police chief says, round up to his men. He says, round up the usual suspects. In other words, we will go through a checklist here and from a financial perspective and just say, okay, what kind of questions do we have to ask ourselves? What sort of things do we or need we be doing in the short term? Now, if you have already initiated a number of these steps, I applaud you, and that is a very good thing. So perhaps you could look at this discussion as an opportunity to go through your own checklist and see if you've missed anything. Or perhaps at the time we get to the question and answer session, if you'd like to add some observations, I think that would be very helpful for everybody who's attending today. Okay, so let's just move into this question now. First question would be, how much cash do we have on hand? That's an obvious question. That includes what accounts, bank accounts do we have available to us? You might calculate, for example, how much cash do you have as a percentage of your monthly expenses. My guess would be that we probably don't have a lot of cash on hand to be able to pay expenses out several months. If that were the case, a company will be in a very fortunate position of not having to choke up or seize up or stop their operations immediately if they have cash that they can fall back on. Of course, connected to cash would be any short-term investments which have been made by the company. Now, as you know, again, I'll be making references to basic conceptual sort of toolkit items that we should all be familiar with. And if you're not totally familiar with that, it's a good opportunity now to make a checklist of things that you ought to be getting up the curve on very quickly with regard to key financial concepts and the way in which we make use of them. Short-term investments probably should be liquidated. They can be liquidated with very little price risk. They should be very marketable. And that's what they are actually existing for. They earn a little bit of extra return. That's why cash has been put to work, earning a little bit of return. But short-term investments are basically near cash. And that is basically the reserve that you have to be able to meet immediate needs. Let me just say one side point about any long-term investments that you have. If you have long-term financial investments, for example, and this applies equally well um, to personal investments, you probably don't want to touch them or panic and convert them into cash now. Why? Because the markets are down. You're going to realize a loss, and that's not going to be a good thing. So if you can hold off not having to go into liquidating long-term investments, that's probably a useful thing. I'm reminded, for example, back when I was working in banking, the Black Monday, 1987, that was a Wall Street crash, or the stock market crashed. And I was a risk manager at an international bank, which had margin accounts lending to private individuals against their investment portfolios. And I can tell you, the markets were down. It was basically a bloodbath. And anybody who liquidated their investments as a knee-jerk response at that time ended up realizing losses. And that was probably not a good thing for them. I can tell you, 6 months after the 1987 crash, that was in, I think in October, early in the next year, the markets had come back to their previous position. So if you had just had patience and staying power, and you didn't need to liquidate those investments, your portfolio was intact without doing anything. That's just by the side. Let's come back now to the our checklist. Okay, so we've talked about cash here. That was the most obvious thing. Next thing is I'd like to go into sort of working capital considerations. Okay, and this is where we would be talking about the working capital cycle, sort of cash conversion story. And this gives us a very nice checklist now to think about the current assets and current liabilities on our balance sheet, to talk about where cash comes from, where cash is going, our receivables, our payables, and so on, okay? So let's just think about that for a moment. Okay, so if we have to set up an action plan against each of these checklist items, let's look at receivables, starting over here. Let me just see if my pen is working. Yes, it's working. Can you see that? So I'm talking about receivables here. The idea of the working capital cycle clearly is this would be for a manufacturing company. You put cash into the purchase of raw materials, you have work in progress, semi-finished goods, you have finished goods go into your inventory, they get sold. If they get sold on credit, then you have receivables. And if you collect those receivables, you come back into a cash position. So this is a kind of standard conceptual way in which to think about how cash circulates through the operations of our business. This can also be applied to service companies, so it has a broad application, as those of you who know and are familiar with this from our previous courses will be able to appreciate. Now, with regard to receivables, what can we say? Well, your first response is going to be, okay, collect your receivables as quickly as possible. And that's a sensible thing. And if you don't think of it, your boss is going to think of it and tell you, collect your receivables as quickly as possible. Now, you don't want to have the unpleasant surprise of not having had a, how should we say, a rigorous process of collecting your receivables on a regular basis. Okay, now this is not the time to determine that we haven't collected and we've let our receivables get very old. That's not a good situation to be in, and we want to avoid that situation. If you have already been staying up to date with your receivables, that's a good thing, but now you just want to see what else is collectible, and you want to do an evaluation of your existing clients to see what the chances of collectability are, and of course to get into touch with them and see how much of those receivables will you be able to expect in the form of cash on the due dates, or perhaps with some degree of delay. Here's an aside that I just want to share with you. This is really partly sort of a collections practicalities. Anybody recognize this gentleman here? This goes right back 100 years ago. Again, J.P. Morgan. Now, J.P. Morgan said, talking about client behavior, and this is psychology, a man always has two reasons for doing anything, a good reason and the real reason. Now, when you look at your receivables and get in touch with customers, you can be certain that even if you had a customer who is ready to, who could be able to pay you on time, it is very possible that they're going to say that they're going to want to conserve cash, and they're going to want to extend what to them are payables, amounts owing to you, and they're going to say, well, you know, we've got this pandemic, and so we have delays in our ability to be able to pay you. In other words, they're going to give you a good reason, but the real reason is they simply could pay you, but they don't really want to pay you now. It just sounds plausible for them to be able to find an excuse to be able to hold back on cash. Okay, so this comes back to the question of how good your client relationships are. How collaborative are they going to be? Will they understand that you also need to be able to collect as well? So can you strike a deal with them to be able to get some degree of payment, some degree of predictability with regard to cash payments, even if it's unlikely that you'll be able to collect everything immediately on the due dates? Okay. Now, if we turn around and we go to the payables side from our perspective and the amounts that we owe other people, clearly the reaction on our part, the sort of a clear reaction we would make is to try to postpone or to extend our payables, and to use the same excuses, of course, with our suppliers and saying, look, I'm sorry, but you know, we have this situation, you've heard about the pandemic and so on. Yes, 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 yes. This is natural. So we have to move beyond that expectation. We have to simply really do an evaluation of our customers, an evaluation of our suppliers. We have to determine which ones do we evaluate or assess as being mission critical. Because remember, no business really thrives by being cold-nosed with its customers, cheating them and so on. Obviously, we don't want to cheat customers. And we don't want to force our suppliers to the wall so that they fail. Nobody wins in such a case. This is why we can use the fancy term, consultants will use this, of course, we use it to some extent in our courses as well, managing supply chain risk, going up and down the supply chain to understand what the impacts are going to be, both on the customer end and also on the suppliers end, and your suppliers as well, to understand fully what the repercussions are going to be. We have to take very broad thinking here when we do an analysis. In this way, when you can separate your customers between who you consider to be critical customers that you want to maintain a relationship with, and maybe other customers you don't really care about, you want to kind of threaten them and force them to pay you because maybe that's the last time you're going to see them anyway, you need to make that kind of qualitative assessment. So that's really what you should be thinking about on the receivables and on the payable side. There's a lot more we could say about this story, but I think these are kind of some of the ideas. I'm trying to get behind the numbers that we see in terms of amounts that we owe and amounts that are due to us, and try to put some greater understanding behind those numbers, because when we get to the discussion of doing cash flow forecasts, we're going to have to rely on a predictability as much as possible to be able to assess how much cash can we reckon with in the coming future. Okay, what else are we talking about when we're talking about the working capital cycle? We go through suppliers, and we have to process the stuff. So for a manufacturing company, we will have finished goods. Okay, so now we have the inventory story. Let's talk about inventory for just a couple of seconds here. This is part of the supply chain story, of course. And supply chain executives tend to be focused very much on inventory issues, maybe because inventory is the most tangible aspect of our working capital. And they may pay less attention to the accounts payable and accounts receivable. This is where the CFO, the financial director, financial manager whatever you want to call the position, the person who's taking care of the financing and financial strategy of the company has to remind people who are working on the asset side of the balance sheet, who are working in operations, they've got to take a holistic approach to suppliers and to customers and so on. And it's not only about inventory. Now, as you know, the famous word we use when we talk about inventory levels, we talk about optimizing inventory levels. And of course, one reaction will be, maybe we have too much inventory and we should reduce it, because that will help us to obtain and conserve cash. And that could be, under particular circumstances, that could be a feasible way out. Of course, if your customers have stopped purchasing from you, stop placing orders with you, you're going to end up with inventory, too much inventory that you cannot get rid of. And so that's going to be difficult to push into to your customers, even if you give steep discounts. That's going to be a question of pricing and other considerations that you have to take into account in the context of how people are behaving in the pandemic. On the other side, if you do have ready customers for things that you produce that are very much in demand, for example, food business is not going to, food industry continues to produce and to supply needs. That's about the only thing which people are buying now, except for maybe Netflix films and other sorts of entertainments. Maybe you need to push up your stocks, create buffer stocks or strategic inventories in order to, in raw materials, because you don't want to run short from your suppliers and not be able to meet customer demand. So you can see the inventory story can go in either direction. Running inventories down to conserve cash, but may be necessary to build up your inventories if you're worried about shortages occurring on the other side. For our audience, of course, being in the mostly in the GCC area, if you're connected to the oil business, of course, you have a particular problem if you're extracting oil, pulling a crude out of the ground. You've got to be able to put it somewhere. So there's going to be a storage capacity constraint, and that may well limit production if you can't push it to your customers. If the refineries don't have enough capacity, if you've filled up all the ships and they're just lying at anchor waiting to make deliveries in the future, there's a finite amount of space that we have for inventories. Okay, so that's the inventory story. Let's move ahead now and move beyond sort of the immediate working capital issues we have here and talk about expenses in general. Now, don't take notes. I'm not going to crunch any numbers here. Just put this up as really as a window dressing or as a wallpaper. You want to go through your expenses and you want to divide them into a discretionary, non-discretionary expenses. So let's run through the key categories. Again, they're not listed here. I just put this up for visual purposes, but the checklist that I have would be, for example, travel expenses. Normally, that's the one I've seen most often being cut. People are moving to meetings such as we have right now. We have this possibility to meet now. By the way, the term social distancing is actually a misnomer. And some people have actually said that what we're doing is physical distancing, but we're not social distancing. In fact, we're getting very close in a social sense, thanks to the communications technology that we have. And in this way, through this webinar, we have an ability to become much closer to, in a professional sense, and also in an intellectual sense, and that's a good thing. So let's make the most of it. So we're not traveling. That's bad for the airlines, of course, but if we cut travel expenses, we may have to cut back on marketing expenses, certainly entertainment expenses. Those are discretionary things we cut back on. You may have to trim training expenses, but we often like to say that training expenses should be considered really non-discretionary. They're an absolute must, but of course that would be a little bit of self-marketing, self-promotion. And of course, you probably have instituted hiring freezes at many companies. We'll come back to hiring and question of staff in just a moment. Of course, if you are fixed asset intensive, you've got repairs and maintenance that you have to do. You cannot simply switch off the factory and expect to run down your costs to zero. So there you're going to have to get the operations people involved very quickly to be able to anticipate what kind of costs do you have to incur, which are basically non-discretionary in order to keep your plant and equipment in decent shape. Excuse me. Okay, consultants suggest that focusing on reducing variable costs to conserve cash is a quicker way to get to cash than reducing fixed costs. Let me say that again slowly. The consultants, and I'm talking about, I've sort of reviewed what some commentaries by strategic consultants, by financial consultants, the big four, for example, and come across the statement that they suggest focusing on reducing variable costs to conserve cash. It's a quicker way than through fixed costs. Okay, I'll come back to fixed costs in just a moment. Now let's talk about staff costs for a moment. This is something you probably will have grappled with. There are several things that we can do. I'll go through the obvious things. Maybe there are some less obvious things as well. Now, in the absence of any government guarantees, and in the States, for example, there are attempts through the rescue package, which was passed by Congress recently, was to give some breathing space to companies, especially medium-term businesses, to be able to meet their payroll, to sort of avoid automatic layoffs of people. And of course, from your perspective, you don't want to immediately lay off people who you consider to be skilled or essential staff, simply because hiring them back again in the future, if this pandemic turns out to be mercifully short, will be a bad idea, because A, you will have created a bad will if you've had to lay off people, and they're not going to rush back to coming back to you. And then B, you're going to incur costs of having to recruit and look for and find new people to bring on who have a suitable level of skills. So again, knee-jerk responses, be careful, think it through before you take those steps. What you can do, possibly, is to reduce contract labor. In other words, to redistribute work to permanent staff. Okay. You could also have staff members take leave which has accumulated, leave which is due to them already, because that's a liability from the company's point of view that you would be discharging. You could offer voluntary leaves to people, or involuntary leave, depending on how pressed you are from a cost point of view. If you're under a lot of cost pressure, you may have to convince people to take leaves without pay, but you're not actually firing them, you're putting them on furlough. It may not make them feel much better, but there are different ways in which one needs to play this, because we're talking about people now. I'm not focusing only on numbers. Of course, as financial management, we have to worry about the numbers, but we need to remember that there are people involved behind these numbers. Another thing you may find yourself having to do, and I've heard about this at smaller businesses that really don't have a lot of reserves and are very much pressed, especially startup businesses and so on, is to possibly cut salaries and to tell people, look, we're all in this together, and to expect sacrifices from people. You could, instead of cutting salaries, is perhaps to withhold salaries for a time, so that those salaries will not be lost. It's just that their payment out is going to be deferred. That's a question of how pressed you are as a company, because obviously the argument that one's going to make to employees will be, look, it's either we all make sacrifices, or we end up having to turn off the lights and close down the business, and that would be bad for everybody. So in your individual circumstances, you need to assess what your alternatives are in order to resort to what kind of measure. And then it's a very difficult one. There's no magic solution to these things, and that's what makes this whole challenge so agonizing for everybody involved. if you're obliged to keep people on the payroll and you have the reserves to be able to keep critical people and so on, even if the demand has slackened for your business, then of course there may be ways in which you can keep them occupied by putting them to tasks which you had, sort of like rainy day tasks, things that weren't top urgent, but would be nice to do if we had the time. Okay, well now we have plenty of time to get people working on certain types of projects in order to accomplish things that were on the medium or long-term list in our business. Okay, I hope you can all still hear me. I hope I haven't put anybody to sleep. I'm going to race forward and go through just some of the other things I have on my checklist. We're still in the area of sort of short-term measures. And the next item I have is Capex, so capital expenditures. Now, clearly, capital expenditures, you're going to have a capital budget. And I'll talk about budgets in a few moments. But with regard to capital expenditures, your immediate reaction is going to be, okay, because of these exceptional circumstances, all bets are off with regard to capital spending. And you're going to have to prioritize your capital expenditures. You're going to have to reconsider some things and just basically postpone them. There may be other expenditures that you need to make that were there have to be, maybe from a health and regulatory point of view, things that have to be upgraded. I've spoken of repairs already. So those things will be unavoidable. Remember, you don't want to lose long-run competitiveness, and therefore you don't want to neglect your property, plant, and equipment. Now, I spoke earlier of the focus on reducing your variable costs. Paradoxically, we also want to reduce fixed costs. Obviously, we want to reduce all costs in the business. And sometimes this can only be done by converting fixed costs into variable costs, okay? Now, this is the challenge. We have to juggle several balls at the same time. Now, how would this be done, converting fixed costs into variable costs? Well, one thing that we could do, for example, is we could resort to outsourcing. In other words, okay, here I realize I'm moving into things that would normally be considered sort of longer term strategic considerations, but because we have these challenges imposed on us, we may have a big fixed cost structure. We may have to figure out a way to be able to shed, reduce, trim fixed costs. And I just want to go through a couple of ways in which that might be feasible. So outsourcing non-core activities. Some of you who've taken LEORON courses, strategic type courses, and financial management courses will recall that you don't outsource your core activities, because your core activities are part of your core competencies. That's what makes you as a business. However, there are certain activities which may be feasible to outsource. Transportation distribution may be one. Example comes to mind. One of the case studies that we do in our courses concerns a methanol producing company, and they have a whole fleet of ships. And question comes up, is the distribution, the ships, is that core activity or not? Does the company have a competitive advantage in maintaining their own fleet of ships, or should they be able to focus only on the production of methanol and rely on third parties to ship their product? I don't have a firm answer on that. This is a good time to go through the list and think about your own business in terms of what could be outsourced. Warehousing could be another example. Sale and lease back of assets. Sell the warehouse and lease it back. There you're converting fixed costs into variable costs. Contract manufacturing is another. Typical of companies who may have seasonal peaks in their manufacturing, but they don't want to expand their production capacities to meet only a temporary peak, even if it happens once a year. So what they do is they give the excess amount of production needed, they give it to another company, they outsource it, in order to be able to meet their customer requirements, meet the demand from customers, but they haven't permanently increased their fixed costs. So these are all things that you need to ask yourself. We have to remember that things like outsourcing, sale and leaseback and so on can help ease the pressures on your cash flow. It's all about cash at the end of the day. So what I'm saying is we're talking about some things that would be under the category of strategic considerations, but they have impacts on cash and liquidity at the company. Okay, so just two thoughts here. I think it should be clear from the things we've talked about now that you are, as managers in your company, you have to think outside the boundary lines of your own company. This is actually the latest modern thinking is already there in terms of looking at how far you have influence in the market, customers, and how much influence you have over your suppliers, and that very much their success may be important to your own success, and therefore you cannot simply manage what you are doing in your own four walls as a company. You have to take an interest in what's happening outside, especially when everybody is being affected by this pandemic in this way. Just to give you an example, for years, multinational companies, they do operational audits at their suppliers. Now, suppliers are third-party companies independent of the company in question, which is buying, for example, packaging materials from Turkey in order to run their business operations in Southeast Europe. And what they do once a year is they visit those companies and they run operational audits as rigorous as though they were auditing their own production facilities, because they want things to be done to a very high degree of quality. And it's simply assurance of operations to make sure that there are no interruptions in supplies, the quality doesn't fall down, the delivery dates are impacted. If you're not thinking outside the boundaries of your firm, now is the time to do it, and do it quickly. Also, inside your company, and this is directed at financial managers, you want to try to get the operationally oriented executives in the business to think like CFOs. Again, I mentioned earlier that the people who are operational oriented and running and operating the assets of the business don't always think about the liability side of the balance sheet and the costs and financing costs attaching to maintaining fixed assets and working capital and so on. So the CFO's got to kind of educate the entire company to make sure that in this time of great financial pressure, all managerial and in fact all staff have to wear kind of a financial cap and think about resourcefulness in keeping costs down and conserving cash. Now, in all of this, I have not talked about, who have I not mentioned yet? Can you guess? Well, I have not talked about the banks. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about banks for a moment, okay? So now I'm going outside the company and I'm looking at the banks. So another thing on your checklist will be to look at your bank lines of credit, because in times like this is when you want to be able to draw down lines of credit if you need the cash, you need the liquidity. So what you want to do is you want to reconfirm the availability of lines of credit. Now, you want to check and make sure that you have, if you haven't already, established and negotiated with the banks to have committed lines of credit. Because if the lines of credit are not committed, the banks are entitled to be able to withdraw the lines of credit that they have approved for your company, but they may not have formally advised that those are available to your company. You know the problem of the sort of typical banker. Typical banker wants to lend you his umbrella on a sunny day. As soon as it starts raining, he wants to take back the umbrella. So this is the problem that you have to keep in mind. And if we go back, for example, 10 years to the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, I'm reminded of Fortune 500 companies, for example, that had very good borrowing terms or terms of raising finance directly from the market, they had what we call commercial paper facilities. This is where major companies with good credit ratings were able to place their paper, IOUs, if you want to look at it like that, directly with providers of finance, and they could bypass the banks. So this was a way this is what we call a process of disintermediation. We talk about this in the corporate treasury course, which I run. And of course, banks get worried when companies have a way of being able to raise finance from the markets directly and bypass the banks. So what did the banks do? They got back in on the game, and they went to the companies and they said, look, you're a big company, everybody loves you, you can issue commercial paper and so on, and raise finance under normal circumstances, and that's good. But there may be times when the market is not so receptive of your commercial paper program, and therefore what we'd like to offer you is a so-called backstop facility, so that in times when you cannot raise the amount of finance you need through your commercial paper program, you have a bank facility that we provide to you. It's a committed facility, and we will provide the financing. But of course, you pay us a standby facility fee, which may be 1/8% on the unused amount of credit line. So that's kind of like a backstop or a guaranteed sort of line of credit that the companies can have. And companies do that sort of thing. And that's great. And it's worked wonderfully for years until, when do you think it stopped working? Well, in 2008, when the financial meltdown occurred in Wall Street, and the companies suddenly found that the commercial paper market had seized up and they could no longer place their paper, they turned to the banks. And how did the banks respond? Well, the banks were forced against the wall as well. They had too little capital. They had non-performing loans. They had we had what was called the credit crunch. And the banks were subject to that. They were not in a position to be able to meet their commitments to be able to provide funding to companies during this crisis 2008, at least until the TARP program recapitalized the banks and allowed them to be able to continue to meet commitments. So this just goes to show you that when things are operating in normal circumstances and suddenly everything goes weird, they really get weird. And therefore, the insurance company that you rely on, perhaps, for example, for business disruption, you want to make sure that they're still in business and that they're not suddenly forced against the wall and they cannot pay you claims that you may have because of the circumstances which we're faced with. Okay, so this is the conclusion here. I'm a banker by training, and therefore, even though I'm very critical of the banks, I also want to protect the banks in the sense of saying bank relationships are important, and therefore you should keep in mind financial intermediary. Okay, let me just check here. I'm going back now, hold on. I'm back again, it stopped, what happened? Okay, I need to just get assurance that we're still in contact with each other. And the last message I got, reassuringly, is it's okay. So unfortunately, some of my words may have been lost to posterity. I was talking about last couple of minutes about banking relationships and the importance of maintaining a good relationship with your bank. Okay. And then I moved on to financial intermediaries in general, and to say that if you don't have factoring facilities in place, that might be something which you should consider in order to be able to convert your receivables into cash more quickly by selling those receivables to a financial intermediary. Also, if you haven't heard the concept before, you might also take into consideration the idea of reverse factoring. Now, reverse factoring is the idea of being able to find a factor for your suppliers. So you have payables towards your suppliers, but you want your suppliers to be able to stay in business and to be liquid as well. So what you're doing is you're getting involved, being proactive by making sure that your suppliers are in touch with the right banks, maybe your bank who knows you as a customer of your supplier. And if you give some kind of a commitment to pay receivables on time, then the bank could be in a position to give favorable factoring terms to your suppliers. So you're kind of transferring your creditworthiness to your suppliers so that they get hold of cash more readily in order to be able to maintain their operations and to be able to deliver to you and to be able to sell to you on credit terms as before without demanding or converting to cash terms of payment. So we have to really think broadly here and find all ways in which we can intelligently be able to extend payables, but not in such a way that it becomes a zero-sum game where our suppliers are going to be forced out of business. Okay, I mentioned previously in connection with payroll and support for employees and so on, different types of government support schemes. Now that's something which is still in the works. It may be provided. Some countries are faster than others to be able to put cash in the pockets of employees immediately. But of course, as individuals, I don't want to go into that. That would be another topic which would take us all day. I keep an eye on the watch here. I want to keep pushing forward on other things that we should be thinking about as we move forward. So, next topic. And I just want to move forward on the slides. What you're looking at here is a question of cash flow forecasts. Now, what I'd like to consider is a little bit about budgeting and planning. Let me just spend a couple minutes there because that again is very much critical to, you've gone through the checklist of measures that you can take immediately. Those are short-term measures. And now, of course, you've got to put together some picture about the immediate future in terms of cash forecasting. Now, if you have cash planning tools in the form of financial models in your business already, which is integrated with pro forma financial statements and so on, and ratio analysis and all those weird and wonderful bells and whistles, that's fantastic. If not, then you want to take pay careful attention now, maybe take a crash course in this stuff because it's important for you to be able to put together cash flow forecasts. This is really quite critical. Now, for those of you who do have planning devices and cash flow models, that's very good. You want to put them to work and presumably load them up and see what is the story going to look like now in the near future under certain assumptions. You also want to ask yourself, what kind of tools would you have wanted to have before this pandemic kicked in? There's nothing like a crisis which gives us the opportunity to rethink what kind of tools we need to have. We have to be very pragmatic, very practical about what kind of tools we have. It's sort of like with the military planning for the last war. You want to plan for the next war and try to think about the unthinkable. Very difficult to do, but we have to try to think outside the box. Okay, as you load up your cash forecast models, of course, you want to talk about your revenues. You want to talk about what kind of momentum you have in your revenues, what kind of pricing and volume assumptions you need to make in the near term, and also the related variable costs. You want to be able to understand what your contribution is. So this is requiring a careful and insightful understanding of what your variable and fixed costs are in the business, and above all, the cost behavior in your business. Now's not the time to learn about those things. Your business, you should understand your business well enough to be able to start working out forecasts more or less with the relationships, the variables already worked out. If you know your break-even levels, for example, as many businesses do, so much the better. Then you have more power to be able to figure out how worried or how comfortable are you under the given situation if demand dries up and you've got to trim your expenses very quickly. Which expenses can you trim? Okay, so this is the purpose today. Obviously, we don't have the time to present an integrated cash flow forecast model. We do that in some of our courses that we present. We'll have to leave that for another day. This is just to remind ourselves the inputs that we put into our existing models, or if we have to create a model from scratch, they have to be as accurate as possible. And the conclusions or the outputs of our models have to be rigorous, they have to make sense, and they have to be hopefully actionable. In other words, we have to be able to act on the assumptions that we're making to the extent that we're able to influence costs, spending, expenditures, and so on. What I'd like to remind you is, and of course we can forget about ratios. If you have ratio analyses, that's again great to monitor your business on sort of an incremental day-by-day basis. But in the pandemic, we're talking about business disruption in many cases, and therefore calculating lots of ratios is not going to help you. Do you need to know what those ratios are and how they operate under normal circumstances? Of course you do. So make a checklist of the things that you're maybe a little bit shaky on with the conceptuals, and hopefully we'll be able to come back and meet at the appropriate time in the future to be able to get you up the curve on those things. But for the immediate situation, we need to be able to distinguish between planning and plans. And no better person to quote here. This is Dwight Eisenhower. He was the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe in World War II. And of course, he became President of the United States. And he said, "In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." I'd just like to dwell on that for a moment, because we know that the budgets that we have prepared for this year now have suddenly ground to a halt in many cases and are basically quite useless. So I think the distinction that Ike is making, that was the name popularly of this general, Ike. He said, I think what he's trying to say here is that the discipline of planning forces you to think through the scenarios and the implications of the things that you do, and what resources you need and what you need to prepare for. And if certain scenarios come to pass with regard to market demand and so on, you're sort of prepared for different scenarios. Also, the say a disaster scenario, even if you can't define all of the specific circumstances that will lead to a decline in demand, at least you have worked through the implications from a financial point of view. So planning is indispensable in this way. What he means by plans are useless means the budget you put together is probably very unlikely to correspond to the real world. Even in the best of circumstances, you know how it is. You spend a lot of time putting together your budget the year before. It goes operational, it goes live on January 1st. It probably kind of looks more or less the way it should through the first quarter. And then after that, things kind of go their own way. And therefore, you find yourself stumbling through things that don't match the budget anymore in the second quarter, third quarters, and so on. And then you have to resort to things like rolling budgets and other devices to be able to sort of update your budgets to be in line with reality, to adjust them and take into account the real world. And of course, traditional budgets suffer this sort of disadvantage. So I think that's where Ike is saying plans are like budgets. Once the shooting starts, you're not going to be able to say, well, what was the plan? You have an idea of what your objective is, of course, but when the shooting starts, you have to make on-the-spot decisions based on the bullets that are whizzing at you in the immediate circumstances that you're facing. But this is why planning ahead of time, the discipline of planning, means that you can make decisions. You've got preparation, which allows you to be able to react and to operate more effectively once things start to get very confusing. That's as far as I want to push this analogy now between the military scenario and the real world scenario of how we would like the world to correspond to the plans that we make, but it doesn't. People might say, well, then maybe we shouldn't plan at all because the plan will never turn out to be what we expect it to be. Then you're going to have just total confusion and anarchy, and that's not what Ike's talking about. He says that planning remains indispensable. We just have to work on improving the relevance of our planning tools. So, last word on budgets. Budgets in their traditional sense, they are not going to be very helpful. In fact, they might even give you the illusion of control. And so companies, I could tell you that based on past experience, companies have been able to move away from conventional budgets. And they find that budgets become outdated very quickly, and they've moved to rolling sorts of budgets and other types of, they've adjusted, in other words, their budgetary system to be more in line with the unfolding realities of the markets. And they've actually been able to improve their budgetary systems as a result of those experiences. Okay, I've got another message coming in. Let me just see if, nope, I think everything remains okay. I hope that's the case. I have to check from time to time to see if, nope, I think we're good. And I'm assuming everybody can still hear me. Hopefully you haven't fallen asleep. Okay, again, this is not for today, but longer term. If your business has conditions favorable to an activity-based costing process, that would be good, because then you would be able to help identify products and activities which are value adding in their nature. It helps management to be able to make more effective resource allocation decisions. If you don't know about ABC, that's not relevant to you today in the current climate, but put it on your checklist of things to do and learn about, possibly implement when things stabilize. Similarly, companies are moving to, will move, I think, eventually to more probabilistic forecasting models, which involve Monte Carlo simulations and the like. Again, this is moving, this is very cutting edge. Again, I just want to mention it to you because you should be looking to educate yourselves in these areas, even if they are not common to many companies. You can, on the financial planning side, possibly improve your ability to plan, make your planning more effective, and therefore give your company a competitive advantage over the market. And finally, on the budgetary story here, I just want to say a word about the the close interaction which takes place between the people who are in the financial planning and analysis, which is what we're talking about, people who do forecasts, and people in accounting and reporting, the bean counters that put the numbers together. Because the pandemic could be considered a significant event, and therefore this means it's going to have an impact on the financial statements of the company. Now, my colleague, Mike Turner, who will be talking to you later in the week on IFRS issues, and I think he's listening to this as well. Hello, Mike, in case you're out there. Certain things come to mind with regard to financial accounting impacts, such as loss reserves, impairments, write-offs, determining what earnings are in the company going forward, tax credits, goodwill, and all those sorts of things. I'm not going to talk about them today, but Mike may touch on some of them later in the week. How's that for putting pressure on you, Mike? Okay, but the key thing is, remember, in this world today, the authorities have granted across the board filing extensions for closing the books. The books are going to be closed later. They're going to be subject to adjustments. They may not be considered final, and therefore that's going to make it more difficult for the financial planning and analysis people, the FP&A people, to have definite accounts, numbers on which they can base their forecasts going into the future. So this is going to become an iterative process between the financial forecasting and analysis people and the financial accounting people. Okay, enough said on that side. I've only created maybe an additional headache for you. I apologize for that. Let's get back to our menu. Medium term. I'm going to whiz through this one now because I know the time is getting tight, but this may be, again, just a kind of a checklist in the medium term. What should be improvised in your businesses? And here I'm actually moving into the consideration of things that are more operational. This is where the CFO is also talking about or thinking about the broader strategy of the business and say, okay, in order to be able to cover costs that are unavoidable, what are the immediate opportunities that we can exploit as a business? Maybe there are existing core competencies, for example, the business has, which they can provide, which they can apply to certain types of activities you may not have thought about before. In other words, you have skills which are transferable skills to things that are maybe more in demand in the pandemic. And you will have read about these things. You know, I think about the garment factory, for example, which may produce personal protective equipment, gowns for hospitals, face masks, and things like that. We heard recently about how General Motors and Ford will be are planning to produce ventilators for the hospitals. Let's hope they can do that in time. That's not really for any manufacturing company to be able to get up to speed and to do that. That may be more wishful thinking. Restaurants, for example, if they don't have takeaway options to be able to deliver food to their customers, they should think about doing that. Maybe they should pair up with companies that are distributing things and be able to find ways to be able to accomplish that. Florist shops are obviously shut down now, but maybe florists can find a way to be able to visit customers and stand in the garden. I have people coming to set up my irrigation system. They have time. They're allowed to travel, and working in the fresh air. Construction is another area. Hotels, maybe they can convert some of their occupancy. Their occupancy, of course, is down. Maybe they can make that available to become hospital capacity for businesses. I believe that there is a U.S. naval ship somewhere in Guam, which is transferring their sailors who are infected by the pandemic onto the shore, and they're going to be housed at certain hotels. I don't know. I don't want to name the hotels. Hope there's no conflicts of interest politically here, but I'm not going to get into the politics of the situation. Transport's an interesting area as well. People have to transport themselves. Taxi cabs may still be operating in certain cities. Patients have to get to hospitals, for example. Drivers have to be protected. How do they do this? Well, in New York City, taxi cabs, you probably know, for those of you who don't live in New York from movies and so on, there is a glass panel or a plastic panel between the front seat, the driver, and the passenger compartment. And maybe those panels can be implemented in other places, other cities, in order to protect the driver and to give the passengers greater comfort that they're in a protected area as well, as long as the area in the back seat is disinfected every time the passenger pays and leaves the cab. Perfume companies are doing hand sanitizer, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, this is just an invitation for you to think outside the box and see in what ways perhaps you could be able to redirect your activities in a way that will allow you to be able to do other things which are going to generate cash, not require additional capital expenditures. Maybe they provide some kind of PR benefit to your business if they are useful in serving the community. And of course, you keep your people busy as well, which is also a motivating and a good thing to do. I'm still waiting for my pizza to arrive by drone. It hasn't arrived yet. I have to look out the window tonight. Hopefully they can sort that one out as well. Okay, this is the area of improvisation that I wanted to cover. Think about it this way. You may possibly be a supplier to another business that is short, has demand on one side, but they're short on production capacity, and maybe they require you to announce yourselves to be able to offer your services to someone else to be able to accomplish one of the goals that I mentioned before. In other words, maybe you could be the solution to someone else's bottleneck. Have you ever thought about that? Now's the time to think about that. Okay, good. Let's come back to our menu. Now we're coming slowly but surely to the close of what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to give you a chance to be able to provide some questions and maybe observations as well. I'd very much welcome that from you. Some of you, based on your experience, have something of value to provide to the group, and that would be welcome. So now, long term, just a couple of words on long term, because as one American politician said, don't ever waste a good crisis. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. And what he's saying there is, try to derive the greatest political benefit from it. Now, of course, in business, we're not talking about politics. We're talking about how to derive long-term, perhaps, the best benefits from a bad situation. How to be opportunistic. Oh, yes, I forgot to think of something else under improvisation. Have you thought about, for example, mergers and acquisitions? Is there somebody in your market, in your industry, for example, who may be on the ropes and may be a company that you've wanted to buy? Maybe they've run out of cash, maybe they're desperate, maybe they could become now a good takeover candidate, provided you have the means to be able to finance the takeover. Whether you have to use cash, maybe use shares, you issue shares in your business to the shareholders of the other business, and so on. Mergers and acquisitions is a big area, but it's never too soon under circumstances as unusual as the ones we're faced with now, to possibly you can accelerate a dream that you had to be able to maybe consolidate the market and be able to increase your market share through some kind of selective M&A. Remember, even in tough circumstances, recessions and otherwise, you need to be able to have longer sustainability financially than your competitors. Those are the ones who win. So keep that in mind. Mergers and acquisitions is another area that I would put on the list. Now, if we come back to long-term responses, re-examining the business model, this is where I think it's critical for us to be able to review our supply chains. Are the supply chains too long? Are they too international? Are they too risky? Is globalization about to reverse? Is globalization about to suffer a reversal? Are national boundaries beginning to reassert themselves? We've seen that travel is closed. People cannot cross national frontiers, even within the European Union, between countries. The movement of people is restricted. Perhaps protectionism will be re-implemented. President Trump was talking about slapping on tariffs on oil, which is too cheap, coming out of places like the Middle East and Russia, oil imports to the United States. Again, political dimensions to that, but you have to take it into account to anticipate what ways in which political actors will influence your businesses. So the business model has to be re-examined to see whether the new world that is going to emerge after the pandemic, to the extent that it is a new world, we need to understand and anticipate what those impacts are going to be. But let me bring the question back to one of cash, which is where I started from and where I want to end what I've got to say with regard to the measures that we take: immediate measures, medium-term measures, and long-term measures. And the question is this. We have to ask ourselves, the question here is, should companies be required to hold a higher level of cash for such contingencies as this pandemic? In other words, the question I put to you before, your cash reserves, what percentage of your monthly expenditures does that cover? Or how many months of expenses can you cover with your cash reserves? And I would suggest that the answer is probably very few, because it's not optimal to hold cash because it doesn't earn anything. Interest rates are very low. And in fact, what a number of listed companies have done in the past years, and I have the numbers for the US market, but of course this may be typical of other listed companies as well. You've heard about share buybacks. A lot of companies have taken their excess cash and, not having things to invest in, sort of growth opportunities and so on, they simply return that cash, which they consider to be surplus cash, to the shareholder through share buyback schemes. And even Boeing has done that, airlines have done it, and it's cash that they very much would like to have now, because they don't have it. It's been done and it's gone out the door the past years in order to repurchase their shares. And this is why they're turning to the government, in this case the US government, for certain types of bailouts to be able to have the cash to be able to tide themselves over. So now you can say, okay, this is a political story. Maybe companies should be required by law to hold a higher percentage of their balance sheet in the form of cash as reserves for a rainy day. It may come, it may be. My question to you is, even if it's not required by regulations, maybe it's something that you as a company want to consider doing in the future to maintain a higher level of cash in order to reduce your business risk and the risk of becoming illiquid if such events as the pandemic were to occur in the future. But of course, you have to realize that the consequence of doing that, if you hold higher levels of cash in your balance sheet and your competitors aren't, is you're going to be at a disadvantage to your competitors because your return on equity is going to suffer. So the question is how to resolve this question. I've been thinking about this last few days. It's a corporate finance type of question. And it's a question really of, what do your shareholders want and what do they expect? Who are your shareholders? Do you know your shareholders? Can you determine the type of shareholders that you want to have? Because remember, not all shareholders are the same. Some are risk averse and others aren't. I'm a banker by background. So let me come back to just a parallel there. And I'd like you to think about this. It's sort of a final point I want to make in terms of actions that you can take or things that you should think about strategically from a financial management point of view. And that's going to be the following. If you hold higher level of cash, it would be like a bank that does investment banking activities and therefore engages in more volatile activities, taking higher risks and generating higher returns for its shareholders, or a municipal or a bank which is focused more on mortgages, on certain types of home mortgages, for example, or a community bank which is focused on lending to businesses that they understand and that they're closer to, and therefore the level of risk and volatility is going to be much lower. And those banks will generate a more predictable cash flow from their activities. So the risks, the business risks, are going to be lower for those types of banks. And of course, the return on equity is going to be lower. That's not a bad thing. If you're risk averse, you may want to buy shares in a business that has a lower business risk, even though the return on equity is not going to be exciting, but at least you have a greater predictability of your returns as a shareholder. Now, we have courses which touch on these issues, and this is a very good time to mention them. Our financial management program, for example, the certified CFMP course is coming up very soon. I think it's on the 12th of April. LEORON will be in touch with you and we'll be communicating that to you. These are some of the issues that we're going to be touching on. And of course, we're going to have to review our materials from the standpoint of relevance to the pandemic. But I'm putting that question to you right now to keep that in mind. Maybe even if the law does not require or regulations do not require you to hold a higher level of cash, you will choose to do so because you want to reassure your shareholders, and you've got to communicate this to them, that your returns are maybe not as exciting as other competitors in your industry, but you are not incurring the same level of risk that they have. I have a feeling that going forward, many companies are going to be more sensitive to the types of shareholders that they have. And if they can attract a shareholder base, which is consistent with the level of business risk that they incur, and of course I include in the equation the level of financial risk they want to incur. In other words, the degree of debt that they want to carry in their balance sheet and so on. Those are all considerations which I think have to be explicit. You have to have the tools and the concepts to be able to examine and understand what options are available to you, and then what your opportunities are to be able to go out there and find the right kind of shareholders that will support that kind of strategy that you pursue and the kind of financial strategy and financing that comes along with it. Okay, so that's basically the final thing I wanted to say with regard to measures taken from a financial management perspective. It's quite broad. The last bit here, just 2 minutes on the role of public policy. Well, I've already actually spoken about that. I've mentioned sort of government actions. It's going to vary from market to market in terms of how geared political regimes are towards meeting the needs of business. In some countries, it will be Fortune 500 companies that are have the most leverage, let's say, in the halls of power. We know that small, medium-term enterprises need to be served as well. So depending on the structure of an economy and how close the government is and how sensitive it is to the well-being of the medium-sized and small businesses and private businesses, there can very well be avenues there of assistance. I would guess that countries where the governments are perhaps even somewhat more paternalistic or traditional in their approaches may actually be more helpful to small and medium sized enterprises. I'm being very open here now. I don't believe that the purely free market system is exactly showing all its glory in the world that we have today, and that sensible regulations may be necessary. You have only to go back 10 years to the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and exactly those banks that were operating in the most free market way with regard to subprime mortgages, they are the ones who needed to be bailed out by the government, by taxpayer money at the end of the day. So just think about the consequences there. The moral hazard that exists in the system. These are important things we have to think about, and as business managers and executives, you have to think about the political influences as well. The what else can we say about public policy? Oh, in the GCC, for example, I think the banks were less affected by risky activities, and therefore they were better capitalized, and there were fewer bank failures across the region because the nature of the sorts of activities that they were engaged in, more trade-related, more connected to real economic types of business and customer activities, and less speculative. I think that's a very, very good thing. It speaks for itself. So keep that in mind in terms of what you expect from your banks, and also what you can expect from your government authorities. Now, success stories. I was invited to pull up some success stories from 2007, 2008, and I thought about it. But in a way, I really, because the financial crisis was kind of had certain characteristics, specific characteristics, which related to the financial sector, we had maybe certain perverse types of outcomes because of the bailout money. The success stories were also skewed in the direction of greater concentration in the banking sector. So those banks that were doing all the funny business in the investment area, investment banking area, if they didn't go under like Lehman Brothers and so on, they survived and got stronger by being able to buy up other banks, and they were recapitalized and they were bailed out by the government. Other success stories would have been those people, if you've read the book by Michael Lewis, The Big Short, or seen the movie, I talk about this as well in the Certified Bank Treasury Management course, the program. If you shorted the subprime mortgage market before it collapsed in 2007, 2008, you became a billionaire, basically. So yes, billionaires were created, and there are some wonderful stories of great riches and successes, but it was done on the back of getting of smart investing, shorting a market that was about to collapse, or on the other side, taking advantage of a market that was about to collapse and then getting a government bailout when the market collapse actually came. So I don't think under the pandemic story here, we have too many success stories to look back with great pride in 2007, 2008. Better we look into the future and we sort of figure out whether this crisis is going to be open-ended, how many months it's going to occur, take place, and hopefully things will get back to normal whenever they can. Okay, that's pretty much where I've wanted to take things at this point. I hope I'm okay with time. I hope I haven't lost too many people along the way. And I suppose we can open up the question and answer story here. Let's just see. Let me just read out some of the, I'm going to go through some of the questions now. I'll read them out. I'm not sure if you can actually see them. Özlem, is it possible to share the question and answers with people? Okay. Okay, fine. Let me just read it out so I can think about it as well. How do you deal with cash hoarding as a treasurer? Slow accounts receivable and suppliers wanting cash on delivery. Yeah, I hope I've given some insight into that. The idea that it's not a zero-sum game and that there's going to be cash hoarding. Obviously, even businesses that are well managed and have enough cash, they're going to want to slow down payments to you. If you have some kind of insight into their financial situations, that you can call their bluff and basically say to them, yes, I know that there's a crisis on, but come on, you've got the cash. We've had a good relationship. Tell me when you can pay some of it immediately or on time, because we also have the situation. I'm looking for a collaborative kind of approach here. So I think that, I hope I've kind of addressed that issue. How do you deal with people who are hoarding? I'm talking about, this is other companies, customers and suppliers. What would be better to assume on the total, sorry, let me just go to the next one. What would be better to assume on the total sales forecast up to the end of the year? Oh my gosh, you're asking me to. The only answer I can give there is forecast based on the type of business you're in. As I said, your businesses, the industry you're in, are going to indicate whether you have ongoing predictable business, whether you have business that's simply going to go away and not be replaced, or whether you're going to have business which is going to resume, and there's going to be what we call pent-up demand. Now, it may not be visible on this on the visuals here, but eventually I'm going to have to call on the services of a barber. And there's probably a lot of people who like to keep their hair short are going to have to grow their hair for quite a period of time. So just imagine that when the lockdowns end and people are able to go out again and to mix with each other, then of course there's going to be a huge rush on barbershops and maybe nail the facility. I don't know about that. You have to ask your wives and ladies about that sort of story. But there's going to be a pent-up demand, things that people are going to rush to want to do to catch up with. If you go through 2 cycles of a haircut, then of course you lose the first cycle because you go to the haircut once, no matter how long your hair is, it's going to be cut once and then you're back to normal basically. But there may be other things where there'll be pent-up demand that will benefit businesses, and they're going to find themselves to be very stretched to be able to supply. So you want to make a distinction there between the business that goes away, doesn't come back, business which is postponed and will resume, and possibly with a peak in demand when the time comes. And other business that hopefully will return to some kind of normal. Now, the question is, when does that happen? Well, we may be tied down for a period of time. If I were you, and again, when I say you, I'm not talking to people in any specific industries. This is one size cannot fit all. I would look at certainly a 3-month horizon with lockdowns, and then maybe go out 6 months. This pandemic, I want to be optimistic as well and say that in 6 months, we will hopefully have some degree of control over the medical side of things. I would go, we're in the second quarter now. I would go out to the end of the year. I would look at 3, 6, and 9 month scenarios. And that's really all I can say at this point. It's very difficult for us. This is why it's important on the opportunistic side, what can you improvise? What can you do in the meantime if this hunger period goes on longer than we would like it to go? If you stop promotion expenses, that will affect my current business. This is very true. We all know from examples we give that under normal circumstances, even the best brands in the world don't stop advertising because they don't want to lose even a little bit of market share. Again, it's a question of your priorities. The companies that are in a greater position to advertise, I understand advertising as general has really gone into a tailspin because there's a lot of things that don't appeal and people will not buy now. They're not in a position to be able to respond to lots of advertising. The advertising should be more on the healthcare sides and things that, food, and people can get to the grocery store and they can go to the pharmacies and so on to meet their immediate needs. And there I see advertising for that, but I don't think too many cars are being sold right now. So the question would be, they're going to be car companies that are going to keep their advertising up, or they're going to trim it to keep some kind of visibility in the market. But I doubt anybody's going to be maintaining their budgets at 100% for promotion. Changing fixed cost to variable cost. Is there any experience to change labor rate based on market price for the outsourcing? Is there any experience to change labor rate based on market prices? Well, okay, if I understand the question correctly, the idea is if market prices are being revised downwards, how can we also benefit from this? And of course, I think one of the considerations there is going to be the contractual element. So you may be tied into contractual obligations that you cannot escape from a labor rate point of view. If you are able to outsource labor, then presumably you're making new negotiations which are going to be repriced at market. And of course, that's going to benefit you. That's really as far as I can take that question. I hope that helps add something to. Please use the question boxes also to make observations as well, and I'll be happy to read them out. Okay, LEORON PDI would like to answer the question live. What does that mean? Can somebody just sort of help me out there? I'm addressing these as best as I can.
Hi, Marc. I mean that you will be answering it live, so you can go on with the questions.
I will do that. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Is it not considered a good idea for factoring receivables in this time because factoring company will not accept in this time to open a new contract by this time? Yeah. Okay, again, this is a question really of, that's a good question actually. Not, obviously I'm speaking to the converted when I say that, have you thought about factoring? Well, if you haven't, then you don't have factoring lines in place. However, there are companies with good credit ratings which will continue to be able to attract finance, and therefore they will have obligations they have to meet. So if you have amounts due from those companies, there may be intermediaries, financial intermediaries, who opportunistically are willing to take those receivables off your hands on a recourse, non-recourse basis. And then it becomes a matter of negotiation. They may have the upper hand in terms of being able to negotiate a steep discount to those receivables, depending on how desperate you are to get your hands on cash. So yes, it's worthy exploring. I would open that line of negotiation if you don't have factoring in place. Definitely. You really need to test the market, and you need to contact counterparts to see if there is an appetite out there. It's the financial manager's job actually to test the market, even if he doesn't, he's not ready to deal, to find out what the terms are out there in the market. So that's his kind of intelligence gathering. Some companies' lifeline depend on cash sales. How companies coping in this pandemic situation to pay even their staff costs and other fixed costs? Are companies not in dilemma to choose between employees and business continuity? Well, yes, in a sense, that at the end of the day is what it really, I think, can come down to. If your sales dry up, then you really are talking about forecasts which are assuming that there's no cash coming in, if there's no government support for employees. And here the distinction I'm making, if the government support, Germany, for example, or other countries in Western Europe that are well organized, if they're able to make more or less automatic payments to households, then the households are able to maintain their living expenses under lockdown. And then the key thing is they're going to say to themselves, okay, can I work from home? But if they understand that the company's revenues have dried up, then the payroll has to be frozen as well. And it may be more acceptable to a employee to know that even if they're not going to get their salary now, it's been deferred, they haven't been laid off, and that government support is providing them with their living expenses. In other words, at the end of the day, just from a human point of view, it gives them some reassurance that they're not going to starve. I mean, really, if we look at it this way. And therefore, it takes the pressure off companies to have to pay the salary out if they know that the employees' essential living costs, food and medicine, are being provided for. So yes, in answer to your question, maybe companies are in a fortunate position, depending on the government support schemes that exist, not having to choose between the two, that they can mothball the company, if you will, in other words, to shut it down as much as possible. And while they have to accrue employee salaries, and those will be paid out in some respect in the future, unless the government, again, is able to provide some sort of insurance and take over those payments for the gap, the intervening period. At least companies know that they can maintain links to their employees and say, look, as soon as things, we are generating business again, you're back, you're coming back to work. We haven't got rid of your job. Psychologically, emotionally, I think there are some useful aspects there. Okay. When there are various supports from governments to enhance stability of salaries, paying contributions toward employees' salaries, blah, 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 from the crisis, do you think companies should reduce salaries of their employees to the support level, or companies should consider using the support to continue the wages at the same level? Okay, well, in a way, it's kind of a moral hazard sort of story, isn't it? I mean, if the government is in a position to cover 100% of the salaries, you're not going to you're not going to not take advantage of it. So you want to use the external supports to their full extent. If you don't do it, other companies are doing it anyway. So that's really a discussion at the national level. Nobody's asking you to be to sacrifice your company when other people aren't don't have to do it. Okay, so I think in answer to your question, you should, in your pecking order, you should be looking where the external support comes from the government, and then of course, what is not covered bonus schemes, for example, things that are linked to performance and so on, you may have to renegotiate those and say, okay, those may be payable, but sometime in the future. That falls under hopefully the discretionary category. If I think that if you have goodwill and good relationship with employees, even things that you may be required by law to pay out, part of the discussion probably has to be, look, if we are forced to pay it out, we are going to have to go into some form of Chapter 11, and that wouldn't be good for anybody. And maybe employees understand that as well, and they're going to say, look, I want my company to succeed, and they're not pulling the wool over my eyes. They're being transparent. Again, this is a question of what kind of goodwill has been developed and how transparent company management is in their performance of the company to the employees. So I think there's a lot of context in which this question has to be answered. I hope you appreciate that. Okay, let me just move on down here. How the company will disclosures about the impact, okay, on statements. That's over to Mike. He'll be dealing with that later on, I think Friday. So look for his webinar. It'll be very interesting. I'll be there as well. Any specific advice for real estate sector? Good heavens, no, I think, that's a tough one. I mean, I know that if you're a landlord, for example, and we're talking about residential housing, there's a move in some places to put a moratorium on rental payments. That's connected to, again, the survival of people and meeting their day-to-day needs. When we talk about business tenants, that's a different story. Now that becomes part of the discretionary, non-discretionary payments, the renegotiation, and so on, and relationships. So I think very much that's a relationship story as well. You may, it depends on whether you are in a position to be able to replace a tenant. I know of a story, for example, in the US where there may be some feasible removal or replacement of tenants. That's not going to happen immediately, so there may have to be a renegotiation in the interim period with existing tenants. But you should build backup plans. In other words, if you don't have a good relationship with tenants and you're just able to squeak out enough cash to keep going from them, you may end up having to write off the rest of the amount ultimately. They may fail. If you don't have a good relationship, then you simply want to grab what you can, and then you're going to have an empty space that you're going to want to fill. So you really should have a task force that is looking beyond the pandemic for the day when you want to have the possibility to replace tenants as well. So I'm trying to address both the residential market and the commercial market. Those are, of course, from what little I know about those markets, they're quite distinct from each other, and they have different characteristics. And of course, what the government has to say about these things will differ as well. Okay, we have an internal auditor. In what way you think internal audit may provide help to finance departments when dealing with such situations? Yeah. Okay, click answer live. Hold on, I just have one routine item I have to cover. 1 second, please. Oh, I should click the answer live. How do I click on it live? Type answer. Do I have a pop-up screen or something which tells me whether it's... Well, anyway, I think I'm not repeating the questions. I got down to the internal auditor one. Well, controlling, obviously, understanding how things work in a management accounting point of view. Sure, you should be liaising both with the accounting reporting people and also with the financial analysis people in order to understand what costs are avoidable. I didn't talk about the distinction between avoidable and unavoidable costs. I spoke in terms of discretionary and non-discretionary, but I think as an internal auditor, you want to make sure that your skills, your knowledge about the processes are available to the other parts of the financial teams, particularly with activity-based costing and those sorts of things, even if they're not implemented in your company, those may be tools which are of value to the company going forward. Also, you want to make sure, of course, if you're checking contracts, if insurance premiums have been paid and so on. It's always agonizing when somebody forgets to pay an insurance premium. Business disruption, for example, are those terms applicable now to this situation? Can you claim if you have some sort of business interruption insurance and so on? That may be sort of more a risk management role in your business, but you should be drawing up your own list of concerns and sharing those lists with your colleagues across the company, so that you can very quickly turn them into actionable items if they become, if they are real problems or potential problems. Again, I like to think, I say in other courses that all employees are risk managers. You can't silo the tasks and the functions. Everybody, some people spot a problem sooner than others, even though they're working at the very basic level in the company or have some kind of customer or public contact. So the sooner you get that information and process it, the quicker you are to be able to talk about it. I mean, to meet it, to find a solution. Why the current crisis this crisis has not ended it yet? Well, yes, I agree with that. There are aspects of the 07-08 crisis which are not past us. We haven't fully recovered from it. I totally agree with that. It's a good observation you make. You put it as a rhetorical question. Isn't it that good at this time to do investments, or the bank side, since the market is low in price, and liquidate it later once the pandemic is over? Absolutely. I mean, if you are in a fortunate position where you are able to make investments, this is every recession provides opportunities to those people who do have resources. What you're going to find now, for example, I suspect in the US, you're going to find a growing consolidation in major sectors of the economy. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I leave that for the political economists to talk about. But it's a fact of life that in such times of crisis, those who do have resources and are able to remain standing and weather the crisis are going to come out of this stronger. That's why I mentioned in connection with M&A, if you're in the position to be able to, for example, do a merger where you don't have to use cash, you may not find financing, but where you issue your own shares, that may be a way out for the counterparty as well. Mergers and acquisitions do not all have to be predatory and hostile takeovers. They can also be partnerships in which one partner maybe dictates the terms, but at least realizes that they need the collaboration of the other partner in order to realize the deal. It can be a win-win situation. So I agree with that question wholeheartedly. How would you safeguard the fixed establishment, which in some cases more critical for core competence of the organization given circumstances of severe liquidity crises? Okay, how would you safeguard the fixed establishment? Yeah, well, I suspect this is coming out of sort of fixed asset intensive businesses where sometimes you have to, in fact, maintain the operation practically at a low level in order not to lose effectiveness of your assets. Now, that is almost an engineering question. I really don't have an answer off the top of my head. I really wonder if some companies that are fixed asset intensive, if they are not in a position to be able to prioritize, if you go back to the capital expenditure discussion we had, to really figure out what is core in terms of fixed assets and what can be dispensed with. I'm going to be, for example, with great interest, revisiting the methanol company case to see what they state with regard to their shipping, their fleet, in order to maintain their business mission. Are they selling things which previously had been considered core and which may not be core going forward, depending on what their resources are? And I invite you to do the same. decisions taken in the past in a different context can lead to different outcomes now. What about inventory management for utility producers like power plants? Okay, again, this is requiring a certain level of industry knowledge, which is stretching me a little bit here. I'm not sure I can really just, all I can do is really take a note of that. And say that I would like to try to get back to you if you could make yourself known to Özlem, so that I can try to be relevant and useful. Realize that we do use real industries and case studies in the courses and programs that we do. Today's been more difficult for that purpose. So let me give that a think. I'm writing that one down now. I'm going to have to defer that question if you agree. Should business start to review their current annual budgets, or should they wait and look how the situation develops? Basically, some of the literature I've seen talks about just abandoning, dump your budget, in other words. In other words, don't steer by it. Just really put it to the side, focus on cash now. It really doesn't matter what depreciation expense you're faced with and looking at and so on. That there may be reevaluation questions that are going to concern the financial accounting people and so on. Don't worry about those things now. You need to look operationally at cash movements above all. And then, as I mentioned before, you have to interact with accounting and reporting to understand what the impact is going to be on financial statements. Again, I'll defer that question also to Mike. In medium-term scenario, are you talking of diversification of business? Yeah, well, that's when I talk about improvisation, it is kind of a diversification where you're using existing skills in a way you haven't thought about before. Your existing business may have been very profitable, and therefore you didn't need to look for other ways in which to engage. But maybe now you are in a position where you need to think about what people can do. Let me give you an example. Go back 100 years again, if you will. When the aviation industry was mobilized at the beginning of World War I. Now, there were very few airplanes flying around, but in 1 or 2 short years, airplanes had to be produced in big quantities. Where do you think the skills came from in order to build airplanes? They had to go and find carpenters, people skilled in woodwork, because planes were largely built of wood, the fuselages and the wings. What else did they have to do? They had to get people who were seamstresses, people who worked in the garment industry, because they had to cover the wings with fabric. So they needed people who could sew these fabric onto the wings. They needed, of course, engineering people. So they had people who produced pianos, for example. You have piano wires. You have to brace the wings. You had people who had to be able to put together an airplane together. You had a series of traditional skills which were able to transfer to gearing up the aviation production industry from an HR point of view. Okay, so that's just to give you, by analogy, the sorts of things that we need to think about in order to see where we can be useful. Okay, that's medium-term scenario. Oops. Now, what I just did, I dismissed 8. I don't know what I did. I have to reopen questions. Now I think yeah. Could you please share slide presentation? Well, that's going to be difficult. That's sort of a policy question I always get as well, which I direct to LEORON. Be sure, I'll let Özlem talk about that, because I think you have a possibility of being able to look at the slides again. I really only selected the slides not to teach from them. I teach from those slides in actual programs, but I use them more as a backdrop here to talk about the things I talked about today. So those slides are pulled out of context, and on a standalone basis, they really don't say very much. You need to have the presentations around each of those slides, which are embedded in.
We are back on.
Yeah, diversification, we talked about. How many months planning should we do? Yeah, again, I don't know. 3 months for sure, 6 months possibly, 9 months at the outside. Just look at the rest of this year from a cash planning perspective. And then if you secondarily update your budgets, that's fine. Although I think we're very much working in the virtual actual reality now. It's almost like updating budgets on a rolling basis, almost like a week by week basis. Taking potential SC issues. What are SC referring to? I'm missing that one. I think I've lost you on that one. What do you think aviation industry will be recovered? When do aviation? Good question. Well, in the US, I think aviation is already, Boeing's getting a bailout, so that's going to keep them in business. I think aviation, certainly for the defense sector, should have some degree of protection from national governments. So that's, the good news. So I think largely a political question. Airbus in Europe, I think they probably are more likely candidates to attract some kind of government support. What can non-executives do at the moment to help out? I am not part of the management team. I'd like to add value and support my organization. Work in sales department, okay. And at the moment, our services are on hold. A lot of organizations tend to ignore finance and financial control planning. That's understandable because they're dealing with the asset on the asset side, the operational side. They just look at basic accounting and bookkeeping. How do you recommend I go about communicate the importance of what you discussed to the health and survival of business? I come from a financial backing. Okay, very good. You're from a financial backing, and I know that you can add value. You should be calling up the financial director and directly say to him, look, are you doing cash flow forecasts? If not, I'll be happy to do that. You should also be encouraging your colleagues in the sales department to figure out how do you keep your clients warm? How do you maintain the relationships? What are other, I don't know what business you're in, but how to, can you imagine ways in which, is there a demand still there, but it's not possible to reach your clients at this point? Or is it a demand that will come back in the future? What can you do in the meantime to hold over those relationships? That's kind of a stopgap. That's on the sales side. I'm not sure that the sales department in any company at this point should be sort of just watching TV now and just kind of forgetting about that. Sales means that you're meeting customer needs, and that's very important. And customers continue to have needs in some form, and so you should address that on that side. But from a financial point of view, call your financial director. Okay. Just looking at we're getting very close to time now. That concerns me because I had more questions than I expected. Is the right time to invest due to low demand of prices? There's always been opportunities for such circumstance. Yeah, I think I've answered that already before. What do you think most affected industries? Which industry will recover fast? Oh boy. Again, it's a question of which ones can overcome the crisis and prevail without support. I mean, there are basic needs which have to continue. I think there'll be a shakeout in industries. I think some industries will mothball themselves, and I think they'll come back to life fairly quickly. That's a difficult question. I'm going to defer that question to Mike. He'll be able to answer it when he comes. Mike's going to curse me now for volunteering his services. That's a little bit outside his area, talking about IFRS and so on. But there you go. How can continuous improvement be part of the current situation? Well, continuous improvement, you want to keep your quality up if you are delivering services. That's a tough one as well, because here optimization means something different in a panic. Continuous improvement, you there are critical quality control issues that you cannot, if you're producing pharmaceuticals, for example, you still have to maintain standards. You can't just cut back on those things. So I think that may be a non-discretionary in some respects, but maybe you find ways to be able to streamline. If we have expat labor working in a company, sending them on long unpaid vacation may not be acceptable to labor because they may not travel due to the restrictions imposed on traveling. Then they're basically on holiday. Hopefully they're next to a beach or something when the time comes. Again, I think that may be very difficult for non-nationals if they can't. They may be able to get flights out to their home countries if there are provisions made for that. I know that there were exceptions to the lockdown for that. Otherwise, I really cannot address that issue in any other way. Could you please suggest improved actions to the airlines to make up for the loss of revenue due to flights being stopped? There's probably cargo, but there are cargo companies which already are in the business. Perhaps military. Again, I'd have to think about that. I really haven't had a chance as well to go through and say, okay, which are the industries that are going to be winners. Okay, I think at this point we're getting very close to the end of the day. We just have a couple minutes left. I'm sorry, I don't know if there's some way to be able to record the remaining questions. I think there's several questions here which are remaining. Özlem, I think I'm in your hands at this point. Perhaps I talked too long. I apologize for that. Just wanted to kick some ideas around. Maybe some of the questions are redundant now based on what I've had a chance to address. Let me take this opportunity to wish you all the best of luck. Hopefully you will stay in touch with LEORON in one way or the other, and we'll be able to find a way to interact in a productive and constructive way. Until then, I wish you all the best and stay well. Okay, Özlem, are we okay?
Yes, we are all good. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation, Marc. About the questions, please, if you have an important unanswered question, feel free to email me that one, and we'll definitely get back to you with Marc. And about the training that Marc was mentioning earlier, the certificate in financial management training, I will be emailing the details of that training after the webinar by tomorrow, the latest. Other than that, again, I want to thank you all for joining the webinar. It was a pleasure also listening to you, Marc. Hoping to see you and hear from you in the near future.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and take good care of yourselves.